As no one knew much about my mental illness, a lot of people had the attitude that I had the capability to kick it and get better instantly. This was the most frustrating attitude for me. We must bring the issue of mental illness out into the sunlight, out of the shadow, out of the closet, deal with it, treat people, have centers where people can get the necessary help. I didn't want to do a zoo show. I didn't want to do a study of someone with mental illness. I just wanted to show someone who was trying to live their life. The statistics on sanity are that 1 out of every 4 Americans is suffering from some form of mental illness. Think of your 3 best friends. If they're okay, then it's you. Mental illness, hate and anger exist everywhere, but in America too often it comes armed. Every day on our streets there are people who are facing a combination of homelessness, mental illness, and addiction. Each of these conditions is challenging alone, but when experienced at the same time it creates a downward spiral that makes it even more difficult for the person to get treated and housed. Mental illness is a very powerful thing. If it is with you, it is probably going to be there until the day you die. I am trying so hard to break mine, but it is not easy. It is my toughest fight ever. Most psychiatrists assume that mental illnesses such as depression are caused by chemical imbalances in the brain, which can be treated by drugs. But most psychotherapy doesn't address the social causation of mental illness either. To the fantastic mental illness of rationalism, hard facts are regrettable things, and to talk about them is to create them. Most people have been touched by the battles of mental illness in some way or another. It's either going on in their families or next door to them, or they know people who have experienced it. I think mental illness or madness can be an escape also. People don't develop a mental illness because they are in the happiest of situations, usually. One doctor observed that it was rare when people were rich to become schizophrenic. If they were poor or didn't have too much money, then it was more likely. Every now and then I hear voices in my head, but not very clear. I can't understand what they are saying. It's a mental illness. I have been diagnosed as a manic depressive. The vast numbers of people who suffer some kind of mental illness under capitalism can either think, there is some failing with me, if only I could fit into this system better, if only I were working harder, if only I could enjoy these empty pleasures more, then things would be okay, or the problem is with the system that is making me ill. I am bipolar, and I am proud, and that is why I wanted to write a book, to shine a light on mental illness, to be vulnerable about the days I let it take control and paid dearly for it, and to tell anyone fighting a similar battle, you are not alone. You are not broken. I had some experience in dealing with people who have mental illness and depression, but I didn't see the signs in myself. I couldn't ask for help because I didn't know I needed help. The biggest advice I can give loved ones who are supporting someone navigating a newly diagnosed mental illness is patience, patience, and patience. The war on drugs is very, very real, and the war on helping people with mental illness is very, very real. I'd love for mental illness to be seen in the way that other horrible illnesses are. When people get cancer, very few parents will say, "Oh, I feel so bad for giving you so much unhealthy food over the years." Once you're labeled as mentally ill, and that's in your medical notes, then anything you say can be discounted as an artifact of your mental illness. Any other illness and you have time off work, but there is a lot of stigma around mental illness. It's frightening to talk about it. The people suffering don't want sympathy. We know how to treat depression, we know how to treat mental illness, and we have not had the political will in our country to make it happen. We were never supposed to live until 40. We were built to self-destruct at 30, whether from cancer or mental illness. We're all going way beyond our expiration date. It's my belief that, since the end of the Second World War, psychology has moved too far away from its original roots, which were to make the lives of all people more fulfilling and productive, and too much toward the important, but not all important, area of curing mental illness. Mental illness and gun violence are not directly correlated, but when the two go hand in hand, Americans, often children, lose their lives. Over recent years, urbanization, globalization and the destruction of local cultures has led to a rise in the prevalence of mental illness in the developing world. I think that there's a clinical mental illness called depression, but I believe that post-industrial America has been narcotized by progress. There's a cultural malaise, mental illness or no, that everybody suffers from at some point in their life. The guilt I felt for having a mental illness was horrible. I prayed for a broken bone that would heal in 6 weeks. But that never happened. I was cursed with an illness that nobody could see and nobody knew much about. It can be difficult for people to talk about it, because there still is that stigma around mental illness. But I would encourage people to do that, because they'll be surprised once they do come out, how many other people have had similar experiences. The difference in the quality of medical care received by people with mental illness is one of the reasons why they live shorter lives than people without mental illness. Even in the best resourced countries in the world, this life expectancy gap is as much as 20 years. In the developing countries of the world, this gap is even larger. Many of my fellow atheists consider all talk of spirituality or mysticism to be synonymous with mental illness, conscious fraud, or self-deception. I have argued elsewhere that this is a problem because millions of people have had experiences for which spiritual and mystical seem the only terms available. Sometimes I feel the only way I can get a major publisher interested in mental illness is if I find a character who has bipolar disorder and is also a lovesick vampire attending an English school called Hogwarts. But I'm not giving up. I know I'm not a self-indulgent idiot. I also know I'm not the second coming of Deepak Chopra. If I had believed either of those, or both, as some people do when they get famous, that's when the mental illness arrives. I was the most important person of the world, and people like the Pope would be just like enemies, who would try to put me down in some way or another, or the President. People are always selling the idea that people who have mental illness are suffering. A lot of people are ashamed to talk about mental illness. To me, it's power to give people that. Homelessness, open-air drug use and mental illness, which we all see in this city, are things we've been relying on the DA's office and the jails to deal with. That's really expensive, inhumane and ineffective. My three obsessions are mental illness, horror and religion. People are always selling the idea that people with mental illness are suffering. I think madness can be an escape. If things are not so good, you maybe want to imagine something better. While producing artworks, illusions appear from time to time due to my mental illness. Every day is a struggle for me. I have spent most of my life working with mental illness. I have been president of the world's largest association of mental illness workers. And I am all for more funding for mental health care and research, but not in the vain hope that it will curb violence. We separate problems with the brain into neurological and psychiatric, and it's because it's stigmatized still. Mental illness is still stigmatized. Imagine if we treated people with cancer like that. Just because your personality changes and your behavior changes, all of a sudden you are put in a different category. One of the things psychologists used to say was that if you are depressed, anxious or angry, you couldn't be happy. Those were at opposite ends of a continuum. I believe that you can be suffering or have a mental illness and be happy, just not in the same moment that you're sad. Stress is nothing more than a socially acceptable form of mental illness. What saved my life was my husband. He nursed me back to health, and he continues to do that to this day. It's not easy to be married and to have a relationship with someone with mental illness. Any other illness, any other disease that we're faced with, there's sympathy and understanding. We get help for those. With mental illness, our go-to is to categorize them as, oh, they're crazy, to belittle the problem. I always had a dissociative disorder, but I healed from it over the course of 14 years of big-time therapy. But, everybody's kind of loony now. So I was kind of a pioneer in the mental illness thing, too. We must stop criminalizing mental illness. It's a national tragedy and scandal that the LA County Jail is the biggest psychiatric facility in the United States. When our bodies are sick and people extend their sympathy, bring us soup, offer up solutions. When our minds are sick, people tend to shy away from you, be afraid, or call you outright crazy. I'm fascinated by the way society and individuals view mental illness, and most of my shorts comment on that. The strongest predictor of unhappiness is anyone who has had a mental illness in the last 10 years. It is an even stronger predictor of unhappiness than poverty, which also ranks highly. Children certainly can't learn if they're dealing with trauma or mental illness. People with a mental illness aren't mentally weak. In fact, many of them are incredibly strong. And just like everyone else, they possess the ability to create positive change in their lives. Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.